Well, the man who made the decision to free Abdelbaset Al Megrahi is the Justice Secretary Kenny MacAskill. I spoke to him in Edinburgh earlier this evening. I asked him what he would say to President Obama, who has condemned the decision to release Megrahi.
Well, I respect President Obama immensely, and I listened to representations made by the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and indeed by the United States Attorney General Eric Holder. I rejected the application for prisoner transfer on the grounds raised by the American government and indeed by the American family. However, on compassionate matters, I took a decision that was different to that wanted by the United States of America. I did listen. I understand their position. I hope that they will respect that we have gone through due process. We've listened to them and to the families.
Yeah, but you see, it's not just the Americans. I mean, a lot of people here, for example, Ian Gray, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, has said today, look, on balance, given the gravity of this case, compassion for the victims was more important, no matter what the condition of Mr. Megrahi, no matter what his medical condition, given the immensity of the crime that was committed, compassion for the victims was more important.
Well, this matter divides people not simply in Scotland but around the world. It divides the victims' families. Some are opposed and some are in favour. That's why I'm in the position where I had to make a decision. The likes of Ian Gray have been politicking. He wasn't prepared to say what he would do before I did it. Now he seeks to criticise. I've had to make a judgment, and a judgment I believe is appropriate both for Scottish justice and indeed for the Scottish values. We do believe in Scotland that justice has to be brought to bear, that people who commit a crime, certainly an atrocity like this, have to be brought to account equally. We've always believed that what is part of the defining aspect of Scottish nationality and character is our humanity. Simply because he did not show compassion, simply because he did not treat us in that way, does not mean that we should lower or debase ourselves.
President Obama also called on the Libyan authorities to keep Mr. Megrahi under house arrest on his return. Is that a call you would echo?
Well, he has been released because he's a life licensed prisoner on conditions. Those conditions relate to treatment and indeed residence. Clearly, I have released him on the basis that he's a man who's terminally ill. He is returning to die, not for any other matter.
Right, but again, I would ask you, would you echo President Obama's call to say, look, okay, fine, this guy's been returned to Libya, but let's not just let him out completely, at least call on the Libyan authorities to keep him under some form of house arrest. He can stay with his family, but not be a free man.
Well, the licence applications that he's been released on because he's a life prisoner do specify the requirement for address medical treatment. The basis upon which I have released him is that he's going home to die, to undertake some final treatment that will be palliative. As I say, some of these matters are beyond our jurisdiction when he has flown out of our borders. But the basis and decision I made was on a medical report dated 10th August that said he had less than 3 months to live. I've accordingly allowed him to go home to die.
Why did you go to see him?
Why did I go to see him? Well, we received a prisoner transfer application from the Libyan government. That prisoner transfer application was entered into between the government of the United Kingdom and the government of Libya.
Yeah, but you didn't have to go to see him.
Oh, yes, I did.
Why?
Because Jack Straw, the UK Justice Secretary, when he appeared before the Westminster Joint Committee, made it clear that when an application by a national government was lodged for prisoner transfer, it was appropriate that representation should be heard from the individual prisoner.
Well, that's what he's got lawyers for.
Well, the application for prisoner transfer came in from the government of Libya. Mr. Al Megrahi therefore had to have the opportunity to be heard.
You could have done it in writing. You could have talked to his lawyers. I mean, you see, you realise how this looks, particularly to people in America, that, hang on a minute, you're considering releasing the biggest mass murderer in British history, and you go to have a chat with him.
Well, in Scottish law, we usually have a matter called the best evidence rule, that you listen to the evidence. And I believed that it was better to hear that.
Again, I make the point, that's what he's got. He's got a very expensively assembled legal team paid for by the Libyan government. Surely, in your position, where you were having to make, as you call it, a quasi-judicial decision, it simply was not appropriate, and it looked awful for you to go and visit a mass murderer in prison.
I was required by the prisoner transfer agreement entered into by the UK government with Libya.
But you weren't required to visit him.
In face of the opposition of the Scottish government, to listen to his representation.
You weren't required to visit him.
His lawyer was present with him, and I believe that natural justice dictates that something as fundamental as this The individual should have the right to be heard if that is what he so wished. He asked to make representations. I was required to listen to representations by the legislation brought in by the British government, opposed by the Scottish government, and I therefore listened.
Well, but you see, again, you know this is a very controversial case. By going to see him, you compromised yourself. I mean, what do you say to there will be thousands of people who will say, hang on a minute, are we supposed to believe that the Justice Secretary for Scotland goes to see Mr Megrahi in jail, and by complete coincidence, he then drops his appeal, and 2 days later, he's effectively set free? This is all just coincidence.
We made it quite clear from the very outset that any matter relating to the appeal, and indeed the appeal from the Crown, was a matter for them. It's nothing in which we interfered. We made no declaration, made no request. The matters beyond that are beyond my control.
You see, when you ruled out prison transfer, you said that the grounds on which you made that decision was because you had listened to the views of the US administration and the American families, that their understanding was that there was an agreement before the trial that there should be no return from Scotland should someone be convicted. Now, from the point of view of the American families in particular, and indeed the American administration, that applies to releasing him on compassionate grounds just as much as it applies to prison transfer.
No, it doesn't, and that was certainly not the position made clear to us by the United States government. They didn't indicate that they were opposed to prisoner transfer agreement. They did indicate, and you're correct to say so, on the basis that they believed that they had been given assurances by the United Kingdom government prior to the trial that there would be no prisoner transfer. They did, though, accept that compassionate release was different and that the criteria for compassionate release was different. They asked for medical evidence that was independent and not brought about by the Libyan government. We provided that medical evidence and have published it. They asked us to consider whether he could be released elsewhere from the prison in Scotland to some other venue. I made it clear that I had considered that. I discussed it with senior police officers. The security implications for Scotland were severe, and I accordingly ruled that out.
Hang on. What would you say to a victim, the family of one of the victims, sitting at home in the United States, listening to this, who say, look, I'm sorry, Mr MacAskill,